In this video, I'll be installing Debian 0.93 from 1995 on my 386 PC. Depending on how this goes long term, this might be the last time I install Linux in this series. But first, let's have a look at the state of Linux in 1995. On March 95, Linux kernel 1.2 was released, also nicknamed Linux 95. Some of the improvements of a 1.0 released a year earlier include much better networking, support for multiple IDE controllers in one system, as well as ATAPI CD-ROM drives. The UMS-DOS file system, allowing Linux to be installed on MS-DOS partitions. It adds an overlay of long file names and Unix permission over a fat file system. And a new sound driver, which supports Doom. Distribution-wise, things are starting to stabilize. Tommy Linux appears to fade out, with the last release being in 94. Same goes for SLS, arguably the first proper Linux distribution. It too didn't get any updates after 1994. Slackware continued the lineage of SLS, with many unique and arcane aspects of SLS shining through in modern-day Slackware. Among the newcomers, we see Softcraft. The amount of distributions is about to explode, so I'll probably have to stop with this breakdown soon. Attention in media is also picking up. We're now starting to see some proper eye-catching ads for Linux CDs. And I also found another magazine doing a review of Linux. It's still only casually mentioned in more professional press, but you still never see it in any larger context. You just kind of expect it to know what it is. From what I can tell, among the first few commercial applications of Linux was to turn PCs into X-terminals, and to host web servers. By late 95, 10% of all web servers ran on Linux. You'd also start seeing job listings mentioning Linux. In addition to all this, there was also two major technological shifts happening in the Linux world. One was upgradeable distributions. Before 95, there was, as far as I can tell, no Linux distribution that could officially be upgraded from one release to the next. You were expected to just reinstall everything if you wanted to upgrade. From my research, it seems Debian 0.93 Release 5, released in March of 95, was the first officially upgradable distribution. Others soon followed with, for example, Red Hat 2.0 in September of 95. Slackware, however, is a notable example of a then mainstream distribution that didn't get proper upgradability at this time. But what this also means is that after I've installed Debian in this video, I should be able to upgrade from here on, rather than reinstalling. The other major technological shift was the adoption of the ELF executable format. Up until this point, Linux had used the old a.out format, which came about with the first release of Unix. This is essentially the container format for executables and shared libraries, or DLLs as they are known in the Windows world. While a.out was fairly easy to implement for Linus Torvalds back in the early days, it had limitations. The most pressing such limitation was with dynamic link libraries, or shared objects. On Linux, these were not relocatable. The memory address that they were loaded at was fixed. This meant that all shared libraries on Linux needed to have their address space registered with a central authority to prevent collisions. This just wasn't sustainable anymore. Changing the binary format like this is fairly disruptive. ELF applications couldn't be linked with an a.out shared library or vice versa. ELF and a.out applications could coexist on the same system, however. I can't find any conclusive evidence for why ELF was chosen, but Linux did support ELF and COFF in addition to a.out at the time of the switch. COFF is what most commercial Unix systems moved to after a.out, and ELF was the new hot thing that Unix was migrating towards from COFF. COFF had a number of limitations though, especially in terms of debugging information. If you want to debug symbols for a real-world language like C, you pretty much needed non-standard extensions to the format. The switch to ELF pretty much only had advantages. There was only one small downside. ELF dynamic link libraries were a little bit slower on Intel platforms. This is due to the overhead position-independent coding curse on 32-bit x86-based platforms, as the instruction set isn't really designed for it. A big reason for the migration to ELF was to get support for position-independent code in dynamic link libraries, however, so this trade-off was obviously not a problem. Well, aside from the whole breaking binary compatibility thing, but it had to be done at some point. Red Hat did its migration to ELF with the 2.0 release in September of 95, while Slackware did its migration with 3.0 in November of 95. Debian would eventually get around to it with its 1.1 release in June of 96. The mid-90s was a time of change for other players too. Microsoft was moving from 16-bit to 32-bit on Windows, and Apple was just wrapping up their migration to PowerPC from M68K. Anyway, I think it's time to get this installation going. First, I make sure to back up my stuff from my existing Linux install. Since I don't have a lot of stuff here, that's a pretty quick operation. As we can read in the release announcement, this Debian 0.93 release 5 is a beta. In-place upgrades from earlier releases has been possible, but not supported. The interim releases between Debian 0.91, which is what I currently have installed, and 0.93 release 5 were never public, and have probably been lost to time. Upgrading straight from 0.91 to 0.93 is not possible, as the package format as well as dpkg itself has been completely changed between the two. The 0.93 package format is, however, mostly the same to the one used today. If you're curious about Debian 0.91, check out my video on Debian in the 94 season. Step 1 is to write the floppy disks. There's a boot disk, a root disk and 3 install disks. These and the tools to write them are on the CD. These disks are used to install the base system, which you then install the rest of the system from. I got a plan for how I'm going to do this, so I've also copied an alternative kernel as well as the Lilo package to my MS-DOS partition. A notable sign of Debian maturing as a distribution is that 0.93 has a maintainer assigned to each package, and it isn't just Ian anymore. This is a critical step towards a scalable distribution that can have its maintenance burden spread across many people. This was still a pretty novel concept among Linux distributions. But with the disks written, I can reboot into the installer. I'll be going into this blind as there is literally no documentation whatsoever available for this release. We get a syslinux boot splash, which will be very familiar to anyone who's been using Linux for a while. After loading the root disk, it automatically launches into the installer. I think all we need to do now is to follow this screen step by step. I already have a Linux partition, so I'm just going to remind myself of which one it is. And then format it. Really hoping I got the right partition. I then go into the mount step. This is pretty much the same as the 0.91 installer. The idea is that if you want a complicated hierarchy of partitions, like was tradition on BSD and Unix, you could build that up here. I'll be using a swap file instead of a swap partition, as disk space is always a concern, so I won't be enabling swap here. Instead, it's time to start the install, which, like in the Debian 0.91 install, isn't all that exciting. It copies over the base disks, giving us no other feedback than a long series of dots. Once the disks have been copied, we go into the configuration step. The configuration starts out fairly straightforward. I confirm a partition table and tell it I want a different keyboard layout. I want a Swedish layout, but it doesn't exist in the list. The Finnish layout is however identical, so I just need to guess which of the two I want. I give it a hostname and proceed with configuring my network. I don't currently have a network connected, but I do have a network I visit occasionally. This is then followed by a couple screens where I need to pick the kernel modules I want, as these are not loaded automatically on demand. I then finish up with time zone, which brings me to the final step, to make a boot disk. I got a dedicated Linux boot disk, so I give it that and press enter. And it's time to reboot into this brand new system. My plan here is to install Lilo and then load a special kernel which supports my CD-ROM drive. From there, I'll be able to install more stuff. As I log in with root, I'm prompted to set a root password as well as create a regular user account. This is the first time in the video series that I've created a non-root account, although SLS back in the 92 season did come with a few already set up. So I mount my MS-DOS partition and install Lilo from there. I get this warning that I probably should configure it first, which is fair. But this is when I hit the brick wall running. The only editor included with this base install is ed, an editor completely unusable without its manual. I made an attempt, but I just couldn't drive it. And the program to read the manual is not included with the base system. And this is when I have a confession to make. Notice how the disk images I wrote to the floppy disk was from the C drive and not from the CD-ROM. I wasn't able to read most of the files in the Debian directory from MS-DOS due to all the symlinks and Rockridge extensions, so I copied them over in my previous install. But this means I'm kinda stuck here. So I had a friend bail me out and I got a copy of Vim on floppy disk. With an editor I can use installed, I'm able to adjust my lilo.conf, and I'm able to add the kernel with CD-ROM support. I still can't use my CD-ROM drive though, as it's not on a standard I/O address. Reading through the documentation for Lilo, I was able to find the append command for adding kernel argument strings. That way I can tell it where to look for the drive. And I then hit the next snag. It turns out that this kernel supporting Mitsumi drives is newer than the one I have installed, so it can't load any modules. And of course, both the MS-DOS and CD-ROM file systems are modules in these kernels. So I need my friend to bail me out again to get me the Debian package with its newer kernel. And this new kernel also broke my term cap, so Vim and anything else with a cursors interface behaves poorly. But with the CD-ROM finally mounted from Linux, I can start installing more stuff. But I'm not actually going to set my system up quite yet. Things are a little bit too broken for my liking. I'm supposed to live with this system for a while now, and the vibes are not good. There is, however, a new release of Debian, 0.93 Release 6. This is the first official release of 0.93. The Release 5 I'm running now is a beta version, and it shows. So I'm going to try to upgrade to Release 6 and see if that fixes things. To do that, I'm first going to install a new version of dpkg, which will include a utility called dselect. Dselect is going to make this upgrade process easier, as it will present a nice user interface for dpkg. As I try to install dpkg, I run out of memory, so I guess I need to have a swap file set up first. So I install this new dpkg package and try to run dselect. And it, like Vim, is unhappy with my terminal. So much for making things easier. I have this patch version of 0.93 Release 5 with a few newer packages, so I blindly tried upgrading all of that. But that didn't fix dselect. My patience was starting to run out here, I'll admit. So I ended up just grabbing the 0.93 Release 6 and copied the base directory over to my hard disk and let dpkg rip. I don't know how to upgrade, and if there's no manual to tell me, I'll just revert to brute force. Whoever packaged dpkg did however see this coming, and even gave me an opportunity to confess and tell it what I was doing. It skipped dpkg and carried on with the rest. Except for the base package, which went off with a bang a bit earlier. As it goes, I get a bunch of yes-no questions regarding my config that I haven't got a clue what to answer. But with all those packages installed, I gave dpkg another try. And it seemed to install fine, so I gave base another go, which went better. Here I had even more config to make up my mind about. I basically said yes to everything but the sketchy options, like passwd and groups. But with that, I should be on 0.93 Release 6 now, I guess. So I'll reboot and see if that fixes dselect. I reboot later and it's telling me my system is unconfigured, and it's not even giving me an option to continue booting. I guess the upgrade didn't go entirely smoothly. I do have an idea though. As part of the base package upgrade, I saw a shell script that might be responsible for this. So I grabbed the boot and root disks I used to install Release 5, and I booted back up from those. Once in, I just rename that stupid file and reboot again. This time, the system boots up just like it should, and I've successfully upgraded to 0.93 Release 6 without reinstalling. Still, dselect is not happy with my term cap file, although it throws a different error this time. Vim is, however, fixed. Another thing fixed in Release 6 is that the base system now includes a text editor that isn't completely useless, AE. It reminds me a lot of Joe. It has a bunch of keyboard shortcuts that you need to know, but it also has built-in help, so you can always access them, and this is a much better option for a default editor than Ed. I finish off the base install by adding my MS-DOS partition to my Lilo config, allowing me to boot back into DOS. With the upgrade performed, I proceed to install the development tools. But here I hit my next snag. Release 6 did not come with any extra kernels for using a Mitsumi CD drive, and the upgrade removed the kernel modules for the old kernel. So once again, I need some assistance to get these old kernel modules back onto my system. But with that, I'm able to copy the development packages I need and start the installation, which fails because I forgot to enable swap. I think it's time I add this to FS tab. This time I get a bit further, but it seems I need the kernel headers in addition to the packages I chose. Sorting through these dependencies is something I had hoped to use dselect for. With the headers installed, I can resume configuration of the development tools. And with the development tools installed, I need to compile something else for an upcoming video. And I need to do that now, when I have as much disk space as possible available. But even in this state, I can tell you that compile was tight. But with that compile out of the way, it's time to recompile the kernel. Stock Debian kernels didn't include any sound card support, so I need to build my own kernel for that. The kernel source is installable as a package, so that's easy enough to obtain. We've seen the make config step many times before, and it hasn't really changed a whole lot since last. It's really just a matter of me saying yes to the hardware I have and rejecting everything else. This is followed by a long compile. This time the compile took just over 2 hours. Kernel 1.1.50, about a year older, took about an hour and a half for a similar compile. I am really looking forward to getting a new computer. Anyway, now I can start installing everything else off the CD-ROM. I'll start with X Windows. The main packages needed are in 3 packages, so I start with that. The configuration script offers to help me configure X Windows for my computer, which is a nice touch. It sets up stuff like how my mouse is configured. I'm not entirely sure which device my mouse is connected to, but I was able to figure that out in a separate virtual terminal. It also manages to configure X with the right keyboard layout in this step. Finally, we get to the spicy step. I need to tell it what kind of monitor I have. And then pick up my video card from a long list of cards. I wasn't able to find my card in the list, so I press quit and then tell it I want to use the SVGA server. I am then asked a few technical questions about my video board, like how much VRAM I have. I'm not going to specify a clock chip, it's gonna have to probe that. And it found a bunch of clocks. Finally, I tell it to automatically start up X Windows using XDM on boot. And that's all it took to get X Windows working, but the resolution looks a bit low. A quick look at the generated Xconfig tells us why. It made 640 by 480 the default resolution. That's quickly sorted, and a restart of X Windows later, we're at 800 by 600. In Xterm, we can see that dselect, the package manager frontend that I've tried and failed to use before, almost works. I can enter the main menu and I can tell it where all the packages are, but after that it will fail again. We can still get a feel for what it's like, and I'm able to view the package list and such. Pushing forwards from here, it will next fail to mount the CD-ROM. This just doesn't seem like it's ready. Next is the usual task of trying to get sound working. I've run into some problem getting a graphical mixer compiling. The one that comes with the driver needs XView. XView is the widget toolkit Sun developed before the industry standardized on Motif. There is no package for it in this release of Debian, and installing it from source looked complicated. Putting that aside for now, I was able to get the mod file player built, and that fired up just like it always does, every time since the 92 season. As this is intended to be more of a permanent installation of Linux, it's time to configure a window manager. Debian at this point doesn't offer much in ways of window managers, but it does have FVWM. Switching window manager is as easy as creating a executable accession file in your home directory and placing FVWM there. Now I just need to configure it. For me, this was mostly about reassigning the mouse buttons and adding some programs to the launcher menu. Returning to the failed sound mixer compile, I turned to a software package called Multimedia from the Linux developer's resource CD set. It includes both a mixer application and a CD player. Compiling this was no problem at all, and I quickly had my mixer. Getting CD playback working was a bit more work, as I had to create a symlink to my CD-ROM drive and add myself to the CD-ROM group. Logging out and back in afterwards, that was all working. To round off the multimedia setup, I wanted to get MIDI files playing. Turning again to my CD set, I found something called Play MIDI. It requires svga-lib for some reason, but I get it building and test it with one of the included MIDI files, and it sure seems to work. Next, I want to see how the Wine project is progressing. Wine, or the Windows emulator as it sometimes was called at this point, would allow some simpler 16-bit Windows-free applications to run. This might also be the first time on this channel that we get to see one of these configure scripts that continuously report progress. Still, it fails to catch that I don't have a working parser generator, so I'll need to iterate a bit and install Bison and Flex. I'm still able to run basic Windows games like Minesweeper, but I haven't really gotten any better at. But I'm unable to repeat last year's success with Chip's challenge. Finally, to wrap things up, my 386 with way too little RAM isn't that much of an ex-Windows powerhouse, but I was able to play a game of Space Invaders. I am, however, really looking forward to getting a new computer. But I think that will do for this video. Check back next week, when I'll be building some Windows 3 programs in preparation of a future game day project. Until then, thank you for watching.